Creativity is more than thinking. It's also a feeling, an attitude. Much of this course has focused on cognitive skills, especially the tools that we provided to you for your toolkit, their thinking tools, their cognitive strategies. Let's look at an analogy for creativity, the analogy of a car. Thinking is like the systems in your car, the engine and the braking system. Our process lectures have worked on improving the mechanics of these systems. The driver controls the mechanics of the car, when to use the accelerator, when to use the brake, how to shift. In fact, shifting is very much like the metacognition skills that we've learned, moving through the gears, knowing when to be in what gear. Overall, the driver determines how effectively the mechanics are being used. Are they being maximized? So what is it about the driver that helps to maximize the use of these mechanics? Well, often it's the driver's attitude, the driver's emotional state. Some artists might even say that creativity is about feeling far more than it is about thinking. A complex, shifting mixture of feelings. Either way, we want to pay attention to our emotions, how emotions can hinder us or how they can help us. In terms of managing these, kind of like managing a car, paying attention to our attitude will help us to be more effective, both in maximizing our car as well as maximizing our creativity. Early on, a distinction was made between skills, tools, and mindset. Lectures on process focused on tools to improve our skills. This lecture focuses on the mindset. The mindset we have serves as a lid for our skills, and it limits our success in using the tools. We need the right mindset to maximize the power of our car. We need the right mindset to maximize the power of creative thinking. To improve mindset for creativity, we will explore an increasingly popular topic, emotional intelligence, also referred to as EQ or emotional quotient. IQ focuses on an ability to process information. It's fallen short of its promise to predict success. In contrast, emotional intelligence looks at how we relate to ourselves, our inner world, and to others. Emotional intelligence was popularized by Daniel Goleman, and it's based on sound psychological study. Put simply, emotional intelligence is about three things. It's about being self-aware, understanding your emotions. And then once you understand your emotions, to learn to facilitate and work with those emotions. Self-control, it's referred to. And empathy. Empathy, being able to connect to others readily, to understand their emotional states. Let's look at some popular examples. Not necessarily creative examples, but popular examples that bring to light how emotional intelligence works. Here are two sets of names. In set A, we have Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Reagan, and Obama. In set B, we have Wilson, Hoover, Johnson, and Nixon. You see, some psychologists have attributed presidential creativity and success to EQ, their emotional quotient. Let's look for the evidence of EQ, self-awareness, self-control, and empathy among presidents with high IQ. Lincoln demonstrated self-awareness and self-control when he stated, "Nearly all men can stand adversity. But if you want to test a man's character, give him power." Despite having great power, Washington, who probably could have made himself a king, showed incredible self-control. Obama demonstrated unflappable self-control in the face of a political campaign that featured high levels of mudslinging, including questions about his citizenship. But sometimes he was criticized for being cool, having an apparent lack of empathy. Kennedy showed instant empathy with others in his famous Berlin speech that featured and ended with the statement, Ich bin ein Berliner. EQ allows for some presidents to be successful by building productive relationships with others. Ronald Reagan is a good example of this. Ronald Reagan was described by those he worked with as a kind, humble, and decent person who was devoid of meanness and pettiness. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev described Reagan in this way: while adhering to his convictions, Reagan was not dogmatic. He was looking for negotiation and compromise. Less successful presidents are perhaps indicators of low EQ. Let's take Richard Nixon as an example. It is said that he was a demanding boss who often resorted to bullying. He disregarded others' feelings and their rights, especially those who he believed were against him. Lyndon Johnson had a tendency to be manipulative and interpreted criticism of his policies as personal attacks. Herbert Hoover and Woodrow Wilson possessed great intellectual gifts and self-control. However, they found it difficult to connect to others, and they were perceived by those in the public as being austere and cold. This might highlight an inability to project empathy. Case analyses of these presidents highlight the impact of emotional intelligence on success. Empirical studies provide similar evidence. Let's look at emotional intelligence more closely. Let's unpack it. Let's look at the evolution of the brain, because this gives us hints to our emotional intelligence and how it works. The brain evolved over time to add layers to its structure and its function, and evolved in 3 stages. First was the autonomic brain, responsible for basic physical functions like breathing, things that occur naturally for us, automatically. We don't need to think about how to make that work within our body. Then came the limbic brain, which is responsible for emotions. It helps us to sense danger and to react quickly, the freeze, flight, or fight response. Then came, more recently, the cortex and neocortex, referred to as the rational brain. Learning is recorded here. This area of the brain is responsible for higher thought, like creativity and problem solving. Emotional intelligence is about managing ourselves and our relationships in order to achieve our intentions or our goals. The interplay between our emotions and our thinking then translates into behavior. Low emotional intelligence allows our emotions, reactions in our limbic brain, to override our rational brain. We become so emotional that we no longer think. Daniel Goleman coined a term that describes when our emotions get in the way of our ability to achieve our goals, when our emotions get in the way of allowing us to be successful at solving problems or being creative. He called it emotional hijacking. Now, before I go into examples of emotional hijacking, I want to be clear. When I speak of emotional intelligence, I'm not referring to getting rid of our emotions. When we talk about emotional intelligence, rather, we're trying to minimize the degree to which emotions hijack our thinking, stop us from achieving our goals, such as one we wish to create. Certainly, passion and love are indicators of intrinsic motivation, and this is good for creativity. It creates a commitment to what we're working on and a persistence. The problem is when emotions overrun our ability to create. It's not about shutting down our emotions, but rather working with them. The suffering artist cliché has a germ of truth. Fierce, lucid resistance to what hurts or disappoints us can be risky. Practice emotional jujitsu. Philosopher Martha Nussbaum said, "Do not despise your inner world. Read a lot of stories, listen to a lot of music, and think about what the stories you encounter mean for your own life and the lives of those around you." So let's look at some examples of emotional hijacking when our emotions get in the way of our ability to achieve our goals. And I'll share two examples with you. The first example is a personal example, and the second example is a creativity example. Let's say it's Sunday evening and you can't relax, or you wish to focus on a creative project. You're fidgety and you're stressed because you know every Monday morning your boss holds a meeting in which the staff are regularly criticized. That's an emotional hijack. Your goal is to enjoy the last night of the weekend or to work on a fun creative project, but your emotions prevent you from doing that, from allowing that to happen. Let's look at an example that's squarely on creativity and a creativity experience in an organization, in a team. You're in a meeting, you share a novel idea that's immediately met with criticism. You might feel anger and engage in a fight behavior. Or you might experience fear, at which point you engage in flight behavior. You withdraw your idea. Over time, regular criticism might create a freeze response, inertia in which people are emotionally hijacked so often it becomes a permanent state of inertia in the organization, not just for you, but for others. They live in fear. It inhibits creative thinking. This is a kind of permanent emotional hijacking that clearly puts a lid on our creativity. So why does this happen? Our limbic brain responds much faster than our rational brain. We can hear this in language that we use. I have a gut reaction. My stomach has butterflies. I have goosebumps. It's a pain in the neck. It makes my stomach turn. Often we use these expressions after our body has already responded to some situation. This language indicates how fast our bodies work. We have an emotional reaction before we're able to process it in our rational minds fully. In fact, the limbic brain responds 80 to 100 times faster than our rational brain. Notice how fast you pull your hand back when you touch a hot pot. The limbic system pulls you away from danger faster than your rational mind can think about it. Perhaps those with a slow limbic system were eaten, and therefore this reaction, this fast reaction, was carried on through evolution, passed from one generation to the next. When threatened, the limbic system takes over. The rational brain is not consulted. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. It's part of our evolution. We sense danger quickly before we can even think. Our limbic brain literally takes over. It reacts much faster than our rational brain. However, there is a downside. We become susceptible to emotional hijacking, allowing quick reaction to derail us, and especially in situations where there's no real physical threat. This course has focused on giving you cognitive tools. Creativity involves thinking and feeling. Fear, anger, stress, and other emotions can override your rational brain, makes it difficult to fulfill your creative potential. Runaway emotions literally stops our thinking. Recent brain research has shown that a good mood improves creativity. Good mood activates the anterior cingulate. When anxious, it's not activated. As a result, we limit our options. The anterior cingulate is divided into an emotional and a cognitive component. When we're in a good mood, both parts are activated, and this enhances our emotional intelligence. And we can deliberately improve our emotional intelligence by learning some strategies. How might we improve our emotional intelligence? Well, we can use metacognition and we can become more mindful. And there are two specific ways that we can become more mindful and use metacognition. We can reflect and redirect. Reflection improves our self-awareness. This is that mindfulness. We use our rational brain to process our experience. And then we can redirect. Once we become aware of how we're responding and how we're feeling, we can choose to redirect in a purposeful direction. Over time, once you become successful at doing this, you can build new patterns. In fact, you can learn to shift from your panic zone quickly back into your learning zone. In fact, this is how psychologists help people deal with residual effects of trauma. They help them to learn to discern danger, to stop and assess, to reflect. Is this really dangerous? Working on becoming more self-aware of the reaction that they're having to the situation, and then modifying their reaction accordingly. Again, over time, a new pattern emerges, and we become able to more quickly recognize non-dangerous situations, and then this stops emotional hijacking. We can use the power of emotional intelligence to set our own mindset for creativity. We begin by self-awareness, becoming aware of our internal climate for creativity, setting our own mood. Psychological attitudes that affect our creative problem-solving abilities. Looking at what attitudes we can adopt and control in ourselves that enhance our creative problem-solving. When I do training with people, they often say to me, this creativity training is wonderful, this is great. But the reason I can't be creative, it's someone else. They're stopping me from being creative. They're referring to the external climate factors that surround them, that hinder their creativity. In the next lecture, we'll cover the external climate factors, but for now, let's stay with the internal world, the internal climate. In fact, Arthur Van Gundy refers to this specifically as the internal climate, and he says that we should begin here first, because this is something we can control. It also helps when we create a positive internal climate, it helps us to combat a negative external climate. So we'll begin by examining the internal mood that we can create for ourselves, our own climate for creativity. And this comes from Arthur Van Gundy's work. Think about yourself as I describe these internal attitudes. So, the first one he talks about is openness to new ideas. Do you demonstrate a willingness to hold off judging ideas and judging others? Next is curiosity. Do you constantly ask questions or express wonder about things in your environment? The next is independence. Are you willing to express your own opinion, independent of others' views? How about perseverance? This is the next attitude for internal climate that Van Gundy talks about. Do you press on even in the face of resistance? Risk-taking. Do you engage in situations for which there is some degree of uncertainty? How about discipline? Do you take structured approaches to problems? Do you have a sense of calm about you? And playfulness. Do you toy with possibilities? To Van Gundy, I would add a few more elements to this internal climate. I would add an internal locus of control. It's an old psychological term. It refers to a belief that success is personally determined versus an external locus of control, in which you believe that your fate is controlled by things outside of you, by chance and external factors. I've done some research that has taken Curtin's adapter-innovator continuum, where people express different preferences for different styles of creativity. And we mapped their preferences for what their jobs demanded of them, the kind of creativity that was demanded by their work. Was it adaptive or innovative? And we looked at the gap in between their personal preferences, their personal comfort zone, if you will, and what their job demanded. And what we found was where there was a misfit, where there was a gap, someone who preferred to think in adaptive ways but was required by his or her work to be innovative, we found that they reported greater levels of stress versus those who had a match, a fit between themselves and their environment. However, for those who had an internal locus of control, those who believed that their own destiny was in their hands, it didn't matter how large this gap was. It was superfluous. And as a result, they reported low levels of stress, even if there was a large gap. between where they were and how they perceived their environment. Next to Van Gundy's internal climate, I would add tolerance for ambiguity, which is an ability to deal with uncertainty and to avoid leaping to conclusions. When facing novel situations, there's going to be more ambiguity. And in a world that's changing fast, we will be facing more novel situations and therefore more ambiguous situations. Low tolerance for ambiguity causes people to get overwhelmed, anxious. They want the answer now, prematurely leaping to a solution or a conclusion. This is an example of another emotional hijacking. For some, tolerance for ambiguity comes a bit more naturally. We can learn a tool that will help us to improve this, however. The tool is called Facts, Feelings, and Hunches. So no matter where you are, if this is kind of natural for you, the tolerance for ambiguity, or it's an area that you struggle, this structured tool can assist you, can help you to deal with ambiguity. It's a series of clarifying questions designed to organize an ambiguous situation. And in fact, it might be useful for you to think through this tool as I describe it to you. You might want to consider a messy, ambiguous situation that you're currently dealing with. So let's think about the facts relative to that situation. What do you know? What are the facts related to this problem? Who's involved? When did it start? Where is it happening? How have you handled similar situations? Why is this a challenge? From facts, we then move to feelings. What are your emotions as they relate to this situation? In a way, we're practicing the self-awareness component of emotional intelligence. What are your feelings about that situation? What excites you? What are you afraid of? What makes you anxious? How does the situation affect your emotions? Let's look at hunches now. These are hypotheses. What do you believe is contributing to this situation? What does your gut tell you about this situation? What makes you curious? What questions do you have that you would like to have answered? This is a structured way in dealing with ambiguity. We organize our thinking along these three areas: facts, feelings, and hunches. We capture our responses to these questions in three categories. It's useful for team discussion, especially where assumptions are being made. It allows for a 360 view of the situation. It helps to clear up assumptions. What is a fact may actually be a hunch or a feeling, and we're able to discuss it and recognize what really is a fact versus a hunch or a feeling. I want to encourage you to personally apply this tool, Facts, Feelings, and Hunches. Take a difficult, ambiguous situation and apply it. Once you get comfortable using it individually, take a shared situation with a trusted friend, a family member, or a coworker, and together apply facts, feelings, and hunches. Perhaps start by independently generating facts, feelings, and hunches, and then compare your analysis. Discuss the assumptions, discuss the differences, work towards some common understanding. This kind of work will help to improve your emotional intelligence. And remember, you can also improve your emotional intelligence through the practice of reflecting and redirecting. Recognize what your triggers are. Practice modifying your response to those triggers. Practice shifting from the panic zone to the learning zone. Recognize when you're in the panic zone. For example, I gave an earlier example of the Sunday night hijack. Become aware of how your emotions are undermining your goal to enjoy Sunday night and redirect your response. As you use creative problem solving, recognize that there are different emotions that help us to be more effective in each area of the process. In Clarify, it's helpful to be more tolerant of complexity. Remember the teacher who was overwhelmed by the webbing tool that I used and too many challenge statements. This creates a tunnel vision. We get locked into the problem as given, and we're not able to explore the problem as understood if we're not able to tolerate complexity. In ideate, playfulness is helpful. Playfulness, as Van Gundy talked about it. When we're generating ideas, brainstorming, and the use of other ideation tools, it's beneficial to have a playful attitude. Those I see who struggle with ideation often are those who struggle with being playful. There's a difference, you see, between being childish and childlike. High creators are childlike. They use that imagination that they were gifted with as children. When we develop, here we want to avoid premature closure, resistance to the urge to make a decision and move forward to implementation too quickly. Remember the carpenter's old adage, measure twice, cut once. Developing great solutions takes time. Premature closure, rushing a decision, can get in the way of fully developing a great outcome. When we implement, here, because we're making a creative decision, we need to tolerate risks. When we're creative, we need to be bold. We're going to be introducing something new to the world. So we have to make sure we allow ourselves to not get shaken or prevent ourselves from getting shaken or unnerved by the possibility of failure or setbacks. When pursuing something new versus something that you've done many times, that zone of familiarity, the zone of comfort, the chance of failure is going to be high because it is novel. Great creators use failure as learning opportunities. As the old saying goes, the person who makes no mistakes usually makes nothing. Develop awareness of the emotions that help creativity, such as those that I just described, as well as those that get in the way of your creative thinking. When does fear, anxiousness, uncertainty get in the way of your creativity? Develop awareness and redirect. When you uplift your emotional intelligence, you'll find that you'll also be uplifting the lid on your creativity.